In this demonstration, I want to show you how to create a custom workflow activity as an action that can be used in SharePoint Designer 2013 based workflows. This custom activity, or action, will serve the exact same purpose as the previous demo's activity did. In this scenario, we're going to create an activity that will abstract the process of querying an external web service away from the workflow author. This activity will accept a single parameter of a customer ID. It will take this ID, query a web service for some additional customer details, extract some values, and return them back to the workflow as output parameters on the workflow. The only difference from the previous demo is that we are also going to create an actions file that will make the activity available to SharePoint Designer 2013. Let's take a look at the web service we will use in this activity. After launching the browser, I'll open an app I like to use to query REST services. It's called Postman Client. This is a free app that you can get from the Google Chrome web store. The service we will use is hosted at the odata.org website. Let me plug in a URL to see the service details. If we look at the customer's entity collection, we see a lot of properties are going to come back. Let's filter this down to a single customer object by modifying the URL to point to a customer ID ALFKI. Now, I don't like to work with XML, so I'm going to switch the return type to be JSON by setting an accept header to be application/JSON ;OData equals verbose. When I run this, we now have what we want the URL to look like, and we're getting back JSON data. First, I'm going to open Visual Studio and create a new SharePoint 2013 empty project and name it Get Customer Details Activity WSP. On the next page in the wizard, I'm going to set the solution to be a sandbox solution. While I could make this a farm solution, it's unnecessarily limiting, as that means it will only be available within a SharePoint on-premises installation because farm solutions cannot be deployed to Office 365. Further, a farm solution gives us nothing here, so we might as well use a sandbox solution, as this is going to be a fully declarative solution anyway. After creating the project, right-click the project and select Add New Item, adding a workflow custom activity, and then name it Get Customer Details Activity. After the activity is added to the project, it's going to open the activity within the designer. Now, the first thing to do here is to add a few arguments to the activity. I'm going to add one input argument of customer ID and 3 output arguments named customer full name, customer address, and customer phone. Next, the following variables are going to be added: Northwind service URL and Northwind service response, the latter being a dynamic value which will be used to store the results of the web service response. To create the URL endpoint for the web service request, I'm going to add an assign activity and set the to property to the Northwind service URL variable. For the value property, I'm going to build a string that's going to take the customer ID argument that was passed into this activity along with the URL we looked at in the Postman client to generate a unique URL for the specific item in the web service. Now, to add a little bit of debugging, I'm going to add a write to history activity and set the message property to the URL of the web service that we just created. Now, I'm going to add a HTTP send activity to call the web service. I'm going to set the method to get the URI to Northwind service URL, the response content to Northwind service response, and then I'm going to click the Request Headers Builder button to open up the Request Headers dialog. Within this dialog, I'm going to add a header parameter of accept equal to application/JSON ;OData equals verbose. This is going to give me the data back as JSON rather than XML. Next, I'm going to process the response by adding a Get Dynamic Value Properties activity. I'm going to set the source property on this activity to Northwind service response, and then I'm going to click the builder for the properties dialog. Now, jumping back over to the Postman app, we can see the properties from the specific object that are returned. Notice there is a top-level D object that contains a few nested properties and other objects. Now, I'm only interested in the contact name, address, and phone properties. So I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio. I'm going to want to specify the path to the different values within the response that are nested within the D object. I'm going to want to assign those to local variables. I can't write directly to the out arguments, so instead I'm going to add 3 options to pull out the desired variables. The last step in our activity is to add 3 assign activities that's going to set the values of our output arguments to the variables that we pulled out of the web service response. Now at this point, my activity is complete. In order to make it accessible though to SharePoint Designer, I need to create the actions file. The file was already created by the project item template, which you can see as it's named as an actions.4 file. Go ahead and open this file, and here I'm going to need to write some XML to tell SharePoint Designer how this should look in the design surface, how the parameters should map over to the underlying activities arguments as well. Now first I'm going to update the name by adding some spaces to the name attribute within the action element, and then I'm going to update the category attribute to something unique like custom activities. Now within the rule designer element, I'm going to add a field bind element. This is going to be used to bind a field in the designer sentence to a parameter on the argument. Then I'm going to add a parameter element outside of the rule designer element, but within the action. Now I'm going to need separate parameter elements for each argument within our activity. So I'm going to create a few copies, and then I'm going to update each one so they point to a different argument name like customer ID, customer full name, customer address, and customer phone. These names match the names of the arguments that are on my activity. Now when an action is added to a workflow within SharePoint Designer, if you remember, it's written out as a sentence with hyperlinks. To configure the sentence for the custom activity, I'm going to update the sentence attribute on the rule designer element, where we should have a hyperlinked item for variables that we're going to want to modify. I'm going to use the %number notation as shown in the demo here. Then I'm going to create a field bind element. I'm going to do this for each item I want to bind to a parameter within the activity in the sentence. Then I'm going to create a few copies of this, specifically 4, and then I'm going to map each %number to a specific parameter that I just listed out in the parameters section of the actions4 file. This is how I'm mapping a variable within the sentence down to a parameter, which is mapping it to an argument on our activity. Now everything's complete. We're all finished. So I'm going to right-click the project and select Deploy. This is going to deploy the project to a SharePoint site collection. And from there, I'll be able to use it in SharePoint Designer.